Well, first, well, let me start by thanking you all for inviting me to present this paper.
Move up closer to the computer.
Let me start my paper with a couple quotations. The first is from Terence, a Roman poet and dramatist in the 2nd century BC. I am a human being. I consider nothing that is human alien to me, unquote. Terence. And the second one is from an advertisement in the Mexico City Metro carriage in 2006. Avoid inequality, show dignity to all, make democracy possible, unquote. In The Enigma of Arrival, 1987, the Trinidad novelist and Nobel laureate V.S. Naipaul, reflecting on his arrival in England at the age of 19 to study at Oxford University, remarked, I quote, "In 1950 in London, I was at the beginning of that great movement of peoples that was to take place in the second half of the 20th century, a movement and a cultural mixing greater than the peopling of the United States, which was essentially a movement of Europeans to the New World. This was a movement between all the continents, presaging a greater mingling of people. My subject was not my sensibility, my inward development, but the worlds I contained within myself. I had discovered in myself, always a stranger, a foreigner, a deep interest in others, a wish to visualize the details and routine of their lives, to see the world through their eyes," unquote. Let me apologize for using V.S. Naipaul. He has written 3 books on India, and all but the last book devastates India, Wounded Civilization. But anyway, he was a great writer. And above all, the quotation I drew was from The Enigma of Arrival. He arrived in London to study in 1950, and I went to Dublin University in 1960, and the experience was the same. So I used that as a kind of introduction. The phenomenon of the migration and cultural mixing of peoples is among the more significant developments of our world. In most major cities, people with different histories and cultures interact with each other. Electronic communication, study abroad programs, travel and trade have brought greater knowledge of the world outside our own. Without denying the force of conflict, whether international, national, ethnic, religious, or social class, interdependence, interaction, dialogue, and coexistence constitute no less a powerful force. In November 1998, the General Council of the United Nations, in a resolution sponsored by the Islamic Republic of Iran, proclaimed the year 2001 as the United Nations Year of Dialogue Among Nations. The then Secretary General Kofi Annan praised President Khatami for his initiative and contribution to the event. An impressive group of political leaders, intellectuals, scholars, and artists attended a roundtable conference at the UN on September 5, 2000, to discuss the framework of the conference in 2001. Mr. Koichiro Matsuura, the Director General of UNESCO, in his introduction, asserted that the underlying message of the conference was that the community of nations must strive for better and more equitable ways of addressing the multiple challenges of globalization. It is our mission, he said, indeed our vocation, to work for globalization with a human face, unquote. In his contribution, President Khatami said that the goal of dialogue among civilizations was not dialogue in and of itself, but dialogue toward attaining empathy and compassion, unquote. Scholars and artists and all concerned should embark on a methodical rereading, he said, and a deeply reflective reinterpretation of great books of various cultures and civilizations. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War created renewed hope of peaceful possibilities for intercultural and international relations. For Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, Africans still wanted to focus on the purely historic aspect of civilization and how it has defined the present and what recovering the past means for human progress. Addressing the West, he said that he hoped that dialogue would encourage self-criticism and acknowledge what was done to other civilizations. The examination of the past was an important means of understanding the present and trying to build a more harmonious and humane future. He also asked there be scheduled a dialogue between religions and within civilizations, and felt that dialogue and self-criticism would encourage openness on issues like fundamentalist movements within religions. The brilliant Jamaican humanist, historian, and scholar, Rex Nettleford, saw the project as educational, mapping the journey to teach young people about the mixing of peoples and cultures of the new civilization that was emerging. He stressed that they must be educated on the principle of acceptance of diversity and understand that the world is made up of persons from all of planet Earth, unquote. The hope of a promising new initiative in international relations based on equality and mutual respect was dashed by the event known as 9/11, September 11, 2001. Attacks on civilian populations in the USA, which brought deaths to thousands. The notion of dialogue and openness between different peoples, cultures, and civilizations was replaced by calls for greater security and patriotic nationalism. But Secretary Kofi Annan, in October 2001, and others, saw that the project of dialogue had become necessary because of the acts of terrorism. Under his personal representative for the dialogue among civilizations, Professor Domenico Pico, and members of Seton Hall University's School of Diplomacy and International Relations, a wide group of distinguished scholars was invited to present their views about the significance of the dialogue among civilizations. Few doubted the significance of the rise to importance of the notions of universal human rights, individual freedom and democracy, and the ideals of equality of all. But the globalization of industrial capitalism, characterized by expanding markets and the explosion of information and media technology, seemed to be led more by private corporations than by governments, a move that threatened, in my opinion, democratic institutions. The sense of this threat has spawned worldwide movements demanding greater accountability, transparency, and more open and democratic societies. This dynamic process was given the name of modernization, an implied progress and also called westernization. Postmodernism was a critique of modernization, in that one of its meanings was the challenge to the notion that modernization was necessarily social progress. Today, globalization has become the watchword for the growing international and intercultural contacts. The convergence has brought an awareness of shared values between diverse cultures and peoples. If democratic institutions remain strong, where there is accountability and transparency of policies, we can work towards creating global institutions and policies to reverse the deterioration of the environment and undertake a truly global project to provide opportunities for all the world's needy to be educated and to uplift themselves. While dialogue was the key to a new interconnected world, we must remind ourselves that genuine dialogue required careful nurturing. The dialogue project was made more urgent after terrorist attacks in the US, Spain, England, India, Indonesia, Kenya, and seemingly endless wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya. Eminent economists have shown the connection between these wars and the Alien Economy. In his article of March 25, 2011, New York Times journalist liberal Bob Herbert wrote, I quote, "Here we are pouring shiploads of cash into yet another war, this time in Libya, while simultaneously demolishing school budgets, closing libraries, laying off teachers and police officers, and generally letting the bottom fall out of the quality of life here at home." He concluded his pessimistic view with the admonition that, quote, "new ideas and new leadership have seldom been more urgently needed." In his article on April 25th of the same year, conservative David Brooks wrote, I quote, "Americans have lost faith in the credibility of their political system, which is the one resource the entire regime is predicated upon. This loss of faith has contributed to a complex but dark national mood. The country is anxious, pessimistic, ashamed, helpless, and defensive." This is before Mr. Trump. If the aborted proposed dialogue between civilizations in 2000 arose from the hope engendered by the end of the East-West conflict and the Cold War, the present cry for a dialogue within and between civilizations comes from the current sense of crisis. The protests of the Arab Spring filled us with a degree of hope, at least in Egypt and Tunisia. But these popular movements needed time to establish new institutions of openness and accountability. They have not endured. I had this theme of dialogue of civilizations in preparing two papers for presentation at the University of Ujjain in India and Middlesex College in New Jersey. Permit me to give briefly the context that created the interest in researching these two projects, because I think the people are important for the theme. The first was a commentary on Mahatma Gandhi's first book, In Swaraj, Self-Rule for India, at a conference commemorating the 100th anniversary of the publication of Gandhi's first book in 1909. Having launched his nonviolent Satyagraha campaign on another 9/11, September 11, 1906, to remove the unjust legislation against Indians in South Africa, he traveled to England in 1909 to lobby British politicians to be sympathetic to his cause. In London, he learned that an Indian student, Madan Lal Dhingra, had murdered an official, Sir William Wiley, and that many Indian students in London that he met felt that all means, including violent means, were justified to end imperialism. On his return to South Africa in late November on the ship SS Kildonan Castle, Gandhi said that the ideas of Hind Swaraj took violent possession of me. He wrote the entire manuscript on the ship's stationery. When his right hand got tired, he wrote with his left hand. 40 of the 275-page manuscript pages were written with his left hand. Essentially a critique of modern industrial civilization and violence. It was published in his newspaper, Indian Opinion, in 1909. Nelson Mandela wrote a beautiful essay on Gandhi's Satyagraha and the method of nonviolent resistance to injustice in the December 1999 edition of Time magazine. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his first book of the importance of Gandhi's nonviolent method in his struggle in America. The other paper was on the novels of the poet Rabindranath Tagore, the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. In 1916, Tagore published his novel, The Home and the World, a work critical of extreme nationalism. That year, he gave a series of lectures on nationalism in Japan and in early 1917 in the USA. The novel and the lectures raised criticism of extreme nationalism. Another interest was his ideal of the school he founded at Shantiniketan in 1901, which later became a university, Vishwa Bharati. In addition to Indian classical texts and arts, students had to study the works of Western civilization, China, and Japan. a project different from Lord Macaulay's Minute on Education, which argued that he had read all the classics of Asian civilizations and found little of value compared to Western civilization. Though critical of the national and international politics of his day, Tagore seemed to feel that if we worked at the smaller world, in our communities, schools, villages, and associations, if we grant them autonomy and liberty, humane social transformation could take place. To quote the eminent historian E.P. Thompson, Tagore's defense of civil society as the foundation of democracy is resonant as well as his courageous espousal of universalism. Gandhi and Tagore were close friends. It was Tagore who called Gandhi Mahatma, great soul. Gandhi called Tagore Gurudev, my teacher. Yet they left space for disagreement and criticism of each other's ideas and actions. When Gandhi organized his first All India non-violent movement in India in 1919, Tagore cautioned him that power in all its forms was irrational and that resistance, like all forms of power, could be used against truth as well as for it. Several letters passed between them in the next 2 years. Gandhi responded that the poet had the gifts to make the milkmaids dance. The majesty of the poet could see truth and beauty like Solomon arrayed in all his glory. But Gandhi added, with his humble talents, he preferred the biblical simile of the lilies of the field because it conveyed the sense of the force of natural beauty and the difficulty of sustaining truth in everyday life. The beauty of the lilies of the field depended upon getting our hands dirty by constant cultivation, sowing, and removing the weeds. In 2009, Roberto Toscano, Italian ambassador to India and former ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Ramin Jahan Beglu, Iranian scholar, sent me a copy of their book, Beyond Violence, Principles for an Open Century. Essentially an essay, it coincided in ideas and sentiment with my own 2 papers. Recalling the tragedies of Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Darfur, Iraq, and Afghanistan, they wondered whether the globalization of modernity was leading the world towards its uncertainties and even ruin. It seemed that the link between politics and ethics was now obscured. They contended that even in democratic societies like the US, India, and France, politics had become morally questionable. The authors emphasized the imperative of integrating ethics into politics. More, they added that they were linked by the concept of friendship, citing Aristotle that friendship is a virtue or implies virtue, and is besides most necessary for living. Without friends, no one would choose to live, though he had all other goods. It stimulates one to noble actions. Friendship seems to hold states together. When men and women are friends, there is no need for justice, while when they are just, they need friendship as well. Moving from Aristotle's ethics to Immanuel Kant's towards perpetual peace, to support their view that relations between cultures and nations were to be guided by peace and mutual respect. They argue that Kant sought to build bridges of peace to bring different civilizations together because the nature of international relations was interactive. The authors added a discussion of whether the conquest of the indigenous peoples of America was justified. I mention this to ensure that we do not ignore mention of the destructiveness meted out to the indigenous peoples of the Americas in any discussion of the role of power and violence in international relations. They included a chapter on the 1550 debate at Valladolid, Spain, on whether the conquest of America was justified, between the distinguished scholar Ginés de Sepúlveda, who argued that the conquest of America was justified to make the Indians Christian, because their intelligence was less than human, more like beings than women. And Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, Las Casas, armed with a manuscript of studies and sources from his long experience in the Americas, presented his view of the question based on the perspective of the indigenous peoples, concluding that not only was the conquest unjust and genocidal, and that the indigenous people were fully human, but that the Spanish government must restore all lands seized by Spain and pay compensation. Throughout the work, there were references to the movements of Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. King, whose ideas, lives, and achievements were utilized to demonstrate that a world beyond violence was possible and not an empty dream. They accepted the usefulness of the Western Enlightenment ideas and liberal institutions based on human and civil rights towards constructing a more humane modernity. But they also made a plea for understanding and respecting each civilization's wish to construct their own modernity, not slavishly copying the Western model. Repeating that imperial conquest and migration have made practically every society diverse in peoples and cultures, their main theme was bold and clear. We must let different others speak as subjects of their own history and respect them as equals without diminishing our human right to be critical. 9/11/2001 brought a major crisis that almost put an end to the promise of the end of the Cold War. As leaders rushed to fortify their nations against the rise of fundamentalist religious groups, the liberal democratic nations moved to create a system of surveillance that, in my opinion, posed a new threat to our democratic rights. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 has broken the neoliberal economic order and has caused governments worldwide to cut parts of their economic, educational, and technological systems. The imperative of solutions like commercial and personal lockdowns and social distancing, necessary to be sure, has brought increased unemployment and pain to all nations. Socially, the pandemic has opened certain social and cultural sores like racism and discrimination to raise their ugly heads in the USA and other developed nations. In the important area of education, teachers and scholars have been forced to create systems of virtual education, which most educators argue do not replace the efficacy of traditional schools, colleges, and universities. 6 months of experience of the pandemic has brought near despair and left us with only the hope for a successful vaccine or a return to normalcy. Understandably, this unresolved situation has forced nations to think about new systems of the economy, health, and education after the pandemic is resolved. But this crisis is unique in that 6 months after, medical scientists do not know fully how to overcome it. Did the virus arise because of prevailing systems, other than it arose in China and spread throughout the world, and that social distancing and the wearing of masks can prevent its spread? Our scientists still are studying the facts and have not come up with definitive answers. Of course, whether the virus is active or not, the issue of global warming and climate change is of fundamental importance. However, there is no doubt that the issue of the pandemic is crucial to the world's survival. Its defeat is of the utmost importance. While the pandemic remains our present danger and finding a solution remains our immediate concern, we must still keep in mind seriously the issues we encountered since the end of the Cold War. In my opinion, we are fortunate to have the recent encyclical of Pope Francis called Fratelli Tutti, translated as "We are all brothers and sisters." I am aware of the criticism of his views by conservative critics, but his voice is important at this time. In this timely work, which was published on the feast of St. Francis of Assisi weeks ago, he pleads for the embrace of the values of fraternity and social friendship in building a more just and peaceful world for all men and women, animals and the earth, and an end to wars. Of course, one is reminded of the United Nations project in the late 1990s, making a similar plea. Pope Francis confessed that the sudden rise of the pandemic while he was working on his social encyclical created an added emergency for our civilization to find hope for a future of happiness. He said that the time has come, I quote, to dream of a single human family in which we are all brothers and sisters all, unquote. He used the timeless biblical parable of the Good Samaritan to illustrate the urgent imperative to become neighbors to different others and to overcome racial, cultural, and social class prejudice. In his mind, he said the pandemic had exposed our false securities, the inability of various nations to resolve problems that affect us all. We must work, he said, for the rebirth of fraternity between all men and women. Let us dream, he said, as a single human family, as fellow travelers, sharing the same flesh, as children of the same earth, which is our common home. Each of us bringing the richness of his or her beliefs, convictions, and voice, brothers and sisters all, unquote. Like many of us, Pope Francis said that it seemed in the 1990s the world had learned its lessons from 2 world wars and the Cold War and worked its way toward various forms of integration, like the European Union, Latin America, and the Caribbean community, fostering peace and development. But this opening to the world was co-opted by the economic and financial sectors, he said. I quote again, there exists no disregard for the common good. This culture promotes individual interests and weakens the communitarian dimension of life, unquote. In another insightful section, he lamented the growing loss of the sense of history, whereby young people now reject the experiences of their elders and the spiritual and human riches they inherited from past generations. He seemed to feel that political life no longer encourages debate to improve people's lives and advance the common good. They were more reliant on marketing techniques. Pope Francis argues that to care for the world in which we live means to think of ourselves more as a human family, dwelling in a common home. Today, he said, forms of injustice persist, fed by a notion of profit based on an economic model that does not hesitate to exploit human beings. Millions, including women, children, and men of all ages, are forced to work in conditions of slavery. Human trafficking and other forms of enslavement are a worldwide problem, unquote. On the important issue of globalization of the world's economy, he said that at his meeting with the Grand Imam, Ahmed al-Tayyib, they issued the following declaration, I quote, we do not ignore the positive advances in the areas of science, technology, medicine, industry, and welfare in developed countries. But there exists a moral deterioration that influences international action and a weakening of humane values, unquote. In his meditation on the pandemic, COVID-19, Pope Francis said that it has revealed our common vulnerability. It has caused pain, fear, uncertainty, and the realization of our limitations. It should make us rethink our ways of life, relationships, and the meaning of our existence, and the values of friendship. If we return to egotistic consumerism when this crisis passes, he said, we will have learned no lesson from this tragedy. We must build a new way of life that seeks to live with others as the road to happiness. Modern civilization seems to have forgotten the suffering of the poor. We must become aware of the special solidarity of the poor and combat the structural causes of poverty, inequality, the lack of work and housing. It means confronting the destructive effects of the empire of money, unquote. As a conclusion of this timely essay by Pope Francis and this paper, I cite the admonition he called political love, recognizing that all people are our brothers and sisters, seeking forms of social friendship that includes all, that it is not utopian. It is a noble exercise of charity, where individuals join together in initiating social processes of fraternity and justice for all. They enter the field of charity at its most vast. I appeal, he said, for a renewed appreciation of politics as a lofty vocation of charity, unquote. Pope Francis ended his encyclical with a universal prayer. I give this prayer to all men and women. Lord, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a fraternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. Thank you.
David, thank you very much for your enlightening and wonderful lecture today. In fact, I read your lecture before,
Yes.
before you spoke. And I think some of the points that you mentioned are really enlightening. Recovering the past, I think that we should do. A self-criticism and devote ourselves to others and to remember what we have done to them. And how terror should not create retribution, but dialogue.
Yes.
So that's a really fascinating and wonderful thought. And finally, you talked about Satyagrah, Gandhi's notion of
Yes.
Satyagrah, which I'm sure Aditya would be very happy to elaborate if he so wishes to. And humane modernity. So that is a great idea. And finally, you talked about fraternity and justice for all. I think that is the message we should carry, and I should not hold you beyond this. And we would like Aditya Pratap Deo, professor at St. Stephen's College of History, and who's been teaching students of Soka University for a long time. And over to you, Aditya. If there is time, you could put in a question, but plenary does not entertain any questions. So let's hope a clarification or so. Aditya, over to you.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Williams. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So it's early morning in India and we are all waking up. So if you, I've taken sufficient sort of trouble to shake myself up. But if you find me somewhat groggy, then please indulge me. I promise not to doze off. Definitely not after this wonderful presentation by Professor David Traboulay. It is an honor for me to be in the same forum as him. He has been my teacher, and as I was listening to him, taken back 26 years to my classroom in Delhi University, when he taught me a course on European history. And it was just like being back there, you know, and I'm really grateful to Professor Williams for allowing me this opportunity.
Oh, thank you.
Good morning to everybody here. I can see some friends also. I'm grateful to Professor Williams and to the Soka University for allowing me this opportunity to join you in what seems to be a very, very topical and laudable initiative. I'm also secretly, but also now openly, happy that what I'm going to say resonates so much with Professor Traboulay's presentation. That was my fear, because to be speaking at the same place as him is an extremely daunting sort of exercise for any former student, as you would understand. You know, I'm still so grateful for all that I learned under him. And I already have another concept to go back with. I'm these days working on, Professor Traboulay especially, on the history of tribal peoples in central India. And the question of the history of politics is something that is concerning me. So the idea of political love is what I think I take back centrally from your presentation. Without much ado, let me just plunge into my own, as you will see, somewhat deficient presentation. But as I said, it is somewhat similar to the kind of sentiments that Professor Traboulay has raised in his presentation, even though in form it is much more general, and it is taken from experience more than study, uh, as one would think such a seminar would warrant. This is a small attempt to reflect on the health of our education practices and the well-being of our society in the context of the pandemic. I think it is still too early to be able, for a historian, to be able to think through things with great clarity at this moment, with what we have been forced to experience in this last year. But nevertheless, I will hazard a presentation of what I think. Further, this presentation is about India, and as I pointed out, is written more from my experience of teaching for about 25 years in the University of Delhi than the deep study of a lot of documentary evidence that would be expected of a historian. So please bear with me in that. The COVID-19 pandemic beginning in China in December 2019 caught the world by surprise. Within months, the scale and ferocity of the pandemic had turned our world upside down, scarcely leaving any part of the world and aspect of life untouched. This whole experience has often made us wonder if we are not the besieged survivors of a post-apocalypse world in a Hollywood movie. The world of education too went into a tailspin. Since education had so far necessarily involved the congregation of children and young people in the spaces of educational institutions, and would have provided a fertile ground for outbreaks of the disease among them, such spaces were the first to be shut down. Our students were quickly sequestered in their homes much before the lockdown in India officially began, and an eerie silence descended on the corridors and playgrounds of schools and colleges, which were normally abuzz with energy and life. As it became clear that the pandemic was here to stay and would not abate for some time, we began to think of how to bring some form of teaching learning back on track. This was to some extent a question of restoring a vital part of social rhythms that comprise the stuff of life, and of hope that we must not give in to pessimism. But not all of it was that. A big part of it, as reflected in our desire to get back to business as usual, despite the huge change obviously constituted by our recourse to the online mode, was habit. By the very nature of the system of education we are part of, we could not think of anything other than just getting everything back to as it was, the digital leap notwithstanding. We wanted the same program done, we wanted it done exactly as before, and we wanted to assess student compliance as in the past through examinations. Needless to say, this imposed a second long trauma on all concerned. The critical questions we must ask at this time are, how did we read and understand the crisis in education? And what solution did we arrive at? These questions cannot be answered without locating the field of education in the larger crisis of the world in the time of the pandemic. I believe that we have misread and misunderstood the crisis as a whole, and therefore have come up with the wrong answers for almost everything. This, I think, is true of the totality of our response to the crisis, the education sector included. It is my first submission that the pandemic is the result of unbridled commercialization and consumerism, and hence of unsustainable living, and not just an unfortunate event that has befallen us unexpectedly. Following from this, my second argument is that therefore, the way out of it and the prevention of any future recurrence of it lies in rethinking the very fundamentals of our civilizational goals and vision. Needless to say, like in the case of other sensitive sectors like healthcare and economy, this would apply to education as well. Our education sector was in a deep crisis even before the pandemic began because of its commercialization and consumerist aspects. By commercialization and consumerism, I mean the tendency to justify something in the market. Of course, a more deeper understanding of this would require us to go into the structures and processes of neoliberal capitalism, but that is a routine that has been done to death, as it were, so many times that I won't venture there, and I will assume that we are on the same page as far as that is concerned. Routine, myopic, and rote teaching learning, shoddy and dated infrastructure, rigid and slothful frameworks and administrations, unequal access, lack of efficacy, absence of civic moorings, and so on. The list of ills plaguing our education system are endless. Not everything listed above is directly the result of commercialization, but the overall framework of commerce, which converts learning into a commodity, gives a form to education which steals its very core, humanity, and leaves behind unfeeling shells where such sterile aspects as listed earlier easily proliferate. Though intimations of new pedagogy, technology, and administration in the field of education have emerged like never before in our country in the last 2 decades or so, and offer possibilities of redressal, the tendency towards commercialization has made them costly and out of reach for most people. The state, which has been part of this trend towards commercialization, has hardly attempted to help out in areas it can, like finance and the ease of process, and in fact has complicated systemic weaknesses by overzealous and self-righteous interference in areas that are best left open and free, like curriculum, calendar, educational philosophy, standards, etc. Ironically, though education is a concurrent subject in Indian governance and could have fostered a diversity of alternatives of conceptions and practices by now, what we have is either a variety or duplication of failure models across the country. In one way or another, directly or indirectly, the state of affairs in education is the function of misplaced social priorities and what it entails in terms of what we do and how we do it. And the biggest tragedy is that even when the signs of our mistakes are clear, we continue as if nothing was wrong, really, and as if getting back to the normal is all that needs to be done. To give an example of the point I'm making, let us look at examinations as a principle and practice within our education system, something that is the final arbiter of the success of the system. In our individual quest for a better life, quite in contrast to traditional mores of communityness and service that were considered the centerpiece of good education not very long ago in gentler times, we ended up making examinations, like we know them today, as the be-all and end-all of learning, even in this time of the pandemic. This is a malaise that manifests itself in the entire range of points in our education lives, beginning with the backbreaking and heavy packed study bags that we carry to school as toddlers, to the malpractices that abound in entrance tests and admission tests in professional institutions. It is in fact all right if we forget to learn altogether. After all, success is its own reward. From the insistence on holding pending exams disrupted by the lockdown, to the open book exam idea in a leading university, to the utter lack of empathy in forcing students to write entrances for professional degrees, even as the caseload of infections mounted to a record high. What was merely a misconceived zarya or method of assessment of learning became the final and sadly inflexible test of the fitness of the system. We had to do the education. That is what the system was telling us, even though everything was showing us that that was not possible, and any attempt to force it would be disastrous. In doing so, in insisting on this inflexible test of our education system, as we understand it, we lost a wonderful opportunity to revisit the question of evaluation, something that has from time to time, when better sense prevails, has been high on the agenda for reforms for many of us. It was time to focus on why our children are not really learning the basics of what can get us a more humane world. Sadly, that possibility seems lost now. Take another example of curriculum, which is going to haunt us truly and persistently in the times to come. Our uniformly heavy, unfeeling, and sterile curricula have long been on the radar for change. Yet, faced with the crisis caused precisely by this kind of knowledge in the final analysis, we decided, like master literalists, to labor precisely these very curricula. Did we for once tarry to ask why our children were completely at sea when they were locked down in their homes? Or whether, in the light of the fact that our hugely advanced knowledge base fell woefully short of understanding and dealing with the crisis, if that knowledge was worthwhile in any sense of the term? That curricula could have been reinvented to teach our children how to do the real home or housework, or connect with family and rediscover the joys of human relationships, or tend the garden and learn about the environment, or even learn cooking, was hardly a thought that occurred to us. Instead, we pushed our children back into the drudgery of routine curricula prescribed by distant boards that could do little to tell us why what they were making us do seemed to be of little application when dealing with the everyday struggles of the crisis of the pandemic. Again, what could have been a moment, even if belated, of the discovery of learning that would give us knowledge of sustainability, got lost under the pressures of habit and short-sightedness. Learning that could help us economize on resource use, think of trees and rivers as sentient beings, care for the little things of life and for our fellow humans, and enjoy the world rather than ravage it, got sidetracked in tension-filled homes that swung between social media anxieties and the stress to maintain the semblance of normality. This has been a real loss. Increasingly, the earth is letting us know that we are living on borrowed time. Perhaps we are already too far gone. But if there was a chance here, we have again squandered it. These examples of curriculum and examination relating to what we teach and how we know whether what is being taught has been learned, it will be obvious, are the heart of the matter. True, one might argue that the pandemic by its very nature required us to find a way out in the immediate to at least make sure that education was not shut down completely. Again, one could say that such a time hardly allowed us the luxury of a comprehensive and fundamental overhaul. Yet, it is precisely the temporal and spatial limitations that the pandemic has placed on education that make it crystal clear what the actual issues are. Control and centralization, lack of flexibility, ineffectual curricula and assessment, among other things. And the pandemic has not prevented us from rushing through the approval of a new education policy, which, though progressive in many parts, like in its push for technology, is still essentially framed within the paradigm of the development of the individual rather than society, and encourages self-advancement rather than civic health. This pandemic is, beyond its specific medical description, a crisis of civic health, and is in turn directly connected to our future on Earth as a species. The solution to that in education should have been the creation and nurture of civic competence and relations. Even a year could have made possible a quick crash course in learning that would be less strenuous and more attentive to our life circumstances. Learning that was not just about doing things as they were, but adaptive towards our current predicaments. That we have not understood the crisis properly and have therefore ended up with solutions that are misplaced might yet be our biggest crisis. Most discussions on the education system in the period of crisis has focused on the question of the digital turn, as it were, what online learning will do. I feel that the question of the digital is extremely important, but it is secondary. The digital, if located within the market, will not solve our problems. It is only when the framework is different and the digital gets located within that there will be a possibility. Otherwise, it will be the same question of the sciences, as we historians have been discussing for a very, very long time. I will now end with something that was sent to me by a colleague not very long back. In this day of social media, sometimes we don't know who is writing what. And so typically there is no author mentioned. But nevertheless, this is something that speaks very deeply to the concerns that I have raised. And I thought, and it's very beautifully written, so I thought it might be worth sharing. And lastly, it kind of dovetails very well with what Professor Traboulay said. So I quote, the anonymous well-wisher of the earth, if I may call it that. And the people stayed at home, and they read books and listened and rested, and exercised and made art and played games, and learned new ways of being and were still. And they listened more deeply. Some meditated, some prayed, some danced, some met their shadows, and the people began to think differently. And the people healed. And in the absence of people living in ignorant, dangerous, mindless, and heartless ways, the earth began to heal. And when the danger passed and the people joined together again, they grieved their losses and made new choices and dreamed new images and created new ways to live and heal the earth fully as they had been healed. Thank you.
Professor Deo, thank you very much for your
Thank you.
brilliant, highly analytical presentation.
Very nice.
I think it was kind of more evocative in its language, and you were able to compress your thought and emotion so effectively. I think we would like to call you the modern Tagore rather than a modern historian. Well, thank you very much. And your point is well taken that how the new pedagogy has created more problems because it does not provide a pedagogical process and skills how to, and we need to rethink the fundamentals of civilization and rethink about commercialization and consumerism and the whole setup of new liberal capitalism. So yes, that is true. You mentioned in the beginning that we wanted to create the same program as before. And that is the point. The structure and the infrastructure, as you said, of education remains the same. Our expectations towards this education system has changed. So this is the key problem, and we don't know the solutions. Yesterday, I was talking at a panel and I mentioned that changes in education come at the very last, at the very end. And first it is economy, as Haruka-san is sitting there, an economist would agree. Economy, health, and various other things, and only towards the end we get into education. So both structure and infrastructure need to be changed, and we only spend, what, 2.9%? And there was a professor from Turkey, and I said, you spend 3.5% of your GDP, and Korea spends 8%. So something to that effect need to be done, and we don't know how. But thank you very much for enlightening us to the issues that are present in education. and what we need to do and move away from rampant greed of commercialization. Thank you very much, Professor Deo. So we end this session and we go to the next session, which is people are, rearing to go there. And I just got a phone call that they need to start. So thank you very much, Professor Traboulay and
Thank you
Professor
all.
Deo.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you.